Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. On a Monday, I want to talk about Archbishop Peter of ROCOR and his comments that he made about Father Peter Ayres. I also want to talk about Metropolitan Jonah and his comments about online Eastern Orthodoxy, Jay Dyer, and a few others. For those who may not be familiar, very much like the Catholic scene in in apologetics, Eastern Orthodoxy has a side that is very, very negative, very polemical. I'm not talking about those who just merely engage others in theological discussions. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'm not talking about just apologetics per se. I'm talking about a very negative, off-putting, polemical bent against non-Orthodox, especially Catholics, in Eastern Orthodox online apologetic circles that has become, in many ways, very, very scandalous. And you know what? Good for some of the Orthodox bishops. They're starting to become more aware of this, or at least they're starting to show evidence that they're becoming aware of it. I don't know how aware they were in the past, but they're starting to address this, and good for them. It needs to be addressed because I think that the conversations that we Catholics have with online Eastern Orthodox don't tend to be very productive because of the quality of their apologists, not just in information, but more in their character, in the way that they conduct themselves in discussions with Catholics. It's incredibly vitriolic, toxic, and I'm hoping that will be reformed in Eastern Orthodoxy so that we can have more productive conversations with their online apologists in the future. But right now, the situation in Eastern Orthodox apologetics online is incredibly toxic. But the bishops are starting to say something about this and rein it in, and I appreciate that they're doing that. And so I want to review some of these comments. Also, especially the one by Metropolitan Jonah, because he himself was once one of the individuals who made productions for one of these online polemicists, namely Jay Dyer. So it's interesting to see his own thoughts and evaluation of folks like that when he himself used to help produce content for them. But first, let's start with Archbishop Peter, again, ROCOR, Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So Eastern Orthodox ROCOR right now is in communion with the Patriarchate of Moscow. They have had a shaky history before where they've gone out of communion and come back. Right now, they are in communion with Moscow. And here is one of the archbishops in the United States for ROCOR. He has some comments about Peter Heers and his recent book on on actually a number of issues. But first, let's go over the encyclical kind of as a whole. He has some interesting things to say before he gets to Peter Ayres. In this first paragraph, he talks about different candidates who come for ordination and may have canonical impediments. And he talks about how there are situations where the bishop may relax certain canons and allow for a person to be ordained even though they have a canonical impediment, such as being married, divorced, and remarried. Then he goes on to talk about, it's kind of interesting. The second point here is names at baptism. You know, the different names that individuals present for themselves whenever they're baptized or chrismated. He mentions how, you know, it would be best if the person already has a Christian name, that they don't come up with another name unless he gives permission for it. And the names that they come up with, he feels that they should be non-exotic sounding. They shouldn't sound like, you know, something Russian, or, you know, it shouldn't sound exotic, because that may put people off who are interested in Eastern Orthodoxy. But then he goes on to say, well, you know, Western saints, you know, the names of Western saints, and this would be saints who are of the West, prior to the schism, prior to the separation with the Latin Church. He says they're acceptable, of course, but it may cause some conflict if a person travels to a traditionally Orthodox country or even visits another parish. And the priest should send those in this situation with a letter explaining that they are in good standing and their name is of a Western Orthodox saint. I thought that was a little weird because it shows how anti-Western some Orthodox are, to the point that even a saint that Orthodoxy recognizes is a saint, if they come from the West, there is suspicion there. It ruffles feathers. This is how anti-Western some of Eastern Orthodoxy has become, and that's unfortunate because they're not really breathing with both lungs when they do that. But then he gets into the issue of economy and strictness, relaxing canons or enforcing canons. And here's where he, starts to get into the situation of corrective baptisms, as they're called, which is a euphemism for the sacrilege of rebaptizing people, though they won't call it that. They're going to use this euphemism. And that's part of the problem. He says, let's return to economy and strictness. Whenever there is a deviation from the canons for pastoral reasons, that decision regarding deviation must be made by the bishop and not the priest, because unfortunately there are some priests even in his own diocese and outside of his diocese, outside of his territory, that take it upon themselves to rebaptize Christians. So somebody who was baptized already and they want to come into their jurisdiction and become Orthodox, some of these priests will take it upon themselves to rebaptize them. And the bishop is saying, no, you don't get to make that decision for me. I make that decision. This is why I ask you, seek my blessing when you feel someone should be chrismated rather than baptized. So they should be confirmed rather than baptized again. Or when a second or third marriage seems good to you for the salvation of those involved. So if you're going to bless their second or third marriage, you need to contact him. Of course, I need you to provide the context for such a deviation from the canons and your advice in this regard, but the decision is ultimately mine. This is all the more the case regarding corrective baptism. Again, this notion of rebaptism. This movement cycles through the church on some sort of regular basis and seems to be doing so again today, which is why I say the Eastern Orthodox need to settle this issue, and which is why Metropolitan Callistus Ware, before he passed away, said it is an absolute scandal that this exists in Eastern Orthodoxy, this phenomenon of rebaptizing converts and then others don't rebaptize them, and it causes all kinds of problems. And one group of Orthodox look at in suspicion at another group of Orthodox, and it causes all kinds of issues. So he said it was scandalous. It needs to be addressed. He was hoping the Holy and Great Council in Crete was going to address it. It didn't. And so here we are. The 70s and 80s saw a resurgence of this movement to correct baptisms or reception into the church that were done incorrectly, quote unquote. This decision whether someone should be baptized once they are already a practicing Orthodox Christian is fully the purview of the bishop. Priests are to baptize. Let's see here. Hold on. I lost my place here. This decision whether someone should be baptized once they are already a practicing Orthodox is fully the purview of the bishop. Priests are not to baptize anyone in such a situation without my express blessing. And a very strong case will need to be made for corrective baptism. This is not something that we can approach lightly. Further, you are not to lobby for corrective baptism among your flock. You're not to, start to promote this or push for it. If someone comes to you asking for such, this is one thing, and you should gather all the information you can in this regard and provide to me. But to suggest this is to someone before speaking to me about it, or to preach or publish in this regard is strictly forbidden. Our calling as clergymen is to help save souls, not to tempt the faithful. If it becomes obvious during your pastoral work among the people that someone was clearly brought into the church incorrectly, then address this question to me. We will decide together if, how, and when to address this to the person in question. None of the sacraments, including baptism, are magical spells that must be completed perfectly in order for the magic to work. We're servants of the Most High God, and his grace is certainly sufficient for us in our salvation, even if for some reason there is some sincere but slightly incorrect practice that brings someone into his church. Now, he addresses this issue because It is coming up, especially from folks like Father Peter Ayres. And so he addresses that first, and now he's going to address Ayres himself. I will now address my concern with the person who seems to be most responsible for the resurgence of the corrective baptism movement in our days. I can tell you that personally. I remember when I was discerning Eastern Orthodoxy, Peter Ayres told me, you have to be rebaptized. And I was like, well, the vast majority of Orthodox around me don't do that. Okay, well, there's this other parish 8 hours away that will rebaptize you. Okay, well, if I don't do this, so I won't really be Orthodox if I'm just received by chrismation? Yes, that's correct. Okay, that's weird. That causes a great deal of problem for a whole bunch of people who have been received by chrismation only. They haven't been rebaptized, and then maybe they become a priest or something. What is the status of their sacraments in the eyes of people who hold such a position? It's truly a problem. And so the bishop is now addressing Peter Ayres directly. Peter Ayres, he has published a new book on baptism that is causing major problems in all of the English-speaking Orthodox world. These concerns about Father Peter are shared by me, our Metropolitan, and other ROCOR bishops, and bishops outside of ROCOR. First, it has come to my attention that Father Peter has been sneaking around our diocese, holding assemblies for the faithful, and instructing them not to tell their local priests about these gatherings. Yikes. Yikes. It has come to my attention that Father Peter has been sneaking around our diocese, holding assemblies for the faithful, and instructing them not to tell their local priests about these gatherings. As the Lord instructed us, wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. This behavior is completely inappropriate, and in my opinion, poisons anything that Father Peter Ayres says or does. I have addressed Father Ayres, Bishop, Metropolitan Sorem, to protest this behavior. At least this seems to be his bishop. Practically speaking, he seems to have no bishop and no flock. You remember there was a letter from the Orthodox bishops recently that came out effectively putting some light on this issue. Who is this bishop? He says that practically speaking, he seems to have no bishop and no flock. At least at one point, he was under Metropolitan Sorem. And I trust the Metropolitan will know where to send my letter if he is not the correct recipient. Second, the reaction to Father Ayres' book has been for priests to take upon themselves the strictly hierarchical duty of exercising economy versus strictness. They're taking it upon themselves to say, okay, I'm going to rebaptize this person. I have addressed this above, so there's no need to address it again. Third, by not recognizing that the hierarchs have the exclusive ability and responsibility to exercise economy versus strictness, Ayres teaches that there is, in fact, no true church. That is, if the hierarchs do not possess the rights of the apostles, then apostolic succession is not present in the Orthodox Church, and there is no grace in the Orthodox Church. And it is not the true church. And if the Orthodox Church is not the true church, then surely there is no true church. And we descend into the Protestant fantasy of branch theory or ecclesiology. I don't know if any of that actually follows, but all that seems like a really long chain argument that, I'm not so sure that would actually hold up, in all fairness. Fourth, by essentially insisting that the canons are self-actualizing magical spells, Father Peter Ayres misunderstands that the canons must always be applied first with love and with the care of salvation of those who have broken the canons. A Protestant approach to the canons, interpreting them personally rather than according to the tradition of the church, is just as spiritually harmful as reading the scripture in this way, which is what a lot of Orthodox are doing, and that's why they end up leaving and going to true Orthodoxy, which is not part of canonical Orthodoxy. It's kind of like your set of Acontists, if you will, in Catholicism, or something analogous to that. It's a breakaway group that is not recognized by the Eastern Orthodox. And it happens because these individuals are interpreting the canons privately, and they're saying, well, my local bishop is violating this canon. He's praying with heretics. He's praying with the local Catholic bishop. He's praying with this and that. He's praying with an Anglican, and they'll break away and say, well, that's forbidden by the canons. And so I'm out. I'm going to the true Orthodox who don't fall into this ecumenism nonsense. And this is kind of some of the stuff that Father Ayres brings up, is this anti-ecumenical slant. And he will often cast aspersions on the Orthodox bishops for their participation in the ecumenical movement. And so there's a lot of undermining of the hierarchy here. The church desires the salvation of man, not his unmerciful correction and punishment to satisfy divine justice that man has broken God's cold-hearted law. I call upon our priests to regard Metropolitan Anthony confession and to follow his Holy Father's advice regarding confession, penance, and other issues surrounding the sacrament. Fifth, by insisting that reception of converts to Orthodox Christianity can only be done by baptism. Father Ayres misunderstands God's grace and treats it essentially as a created object. Oh, that's something they won't like, because you'll usually hear from that crowd the argument against Catholics that we believe in created grace. Now we have certainly seen some people in the Latin Church use that phrase, but it's not what they actually think it means, as I've addressed already on this show. But I kind of wonder if that was deliberate to kind of say, you yourself are guilty of this very thing that you accuse others of. I don't know. God's grace works in accordance with the church, not in accordance with Father Peter Ayres' opinion. Baptism is the standard mode of reception into the church, but already in the 4th century, St. Basil the Great outlines other modes of reception for converts depending on the spiritual situation from which they come into the church. Yeah, and Ayres knows that, and he's going to engage that, and he's going to offer counter arguments and counter canons. And that's part of the problem, is there's a huge debate on which canons are to be enforced and which aren't. And what the bishop is saying is he ultimately gets to enforce which canons are applied and which ones are relaxed in this situation. That is, one must take into consideration the spiritual reality of the convert as well as the pastoral reality of the convert before discussing with one's hierarchy the mode of reception. Over time, a priest learns when a deviation from the standard of baptism may be canonically permissible and pastorally advisable, and discusses this with his bishop as needed. I do not bless the selling or distribution of the book on the reception of the heterodox into the Orthodox Church in our mid-American diocese. So he's saying he does not bless Father Peter Ayres' book in the selling of his book in his diocese. Then he turns to, the issue of priests in the online sphere. It is understood that priests will be present in the online world. Our parishioners spend inordinate amount of time there, which I would like you to try to moderate if at all possible through your sermons and good personal example. And thus the clergy will be there to instruct the faithful as well. However, I ask you to please discuss with your dean or with me any plans to be interviewed or to otherwise act on online outside your parish content or context. As your bishop, I should be aware of everything that is happening in the diocese. Of course, in a normal diocese as huge as ours, that is not really possible, but any deviation from the norm should come to my attention. It is not a good look if I look at the internet and am surprised by pictures, articles, and videos I see there, and this frankly happens all too often. Well, good for him. I'm glad that he is wanting to become more involved and know what is going on with online spheres and circles. That's highly needed. I say the exact same thing for Catholic bishops. They need to be aware. Now, Catholic bishops generally have a lot larger territory than many of these Orthodox bishops, so it's even harder for them to be aware of what's going on feet on the ground. Which, again, I understand they're bogged down with the administrative affairs that just comes with having such a large diocese. I totally get that. But it makes them very much unaware of what's really taking place with the average Catholic. And that's not a good thing. We have to figure out a way to fix that somehow so that the bishops are more aware of what's actually taking place. I say that for the Catholic bishops, also for the Orthodox bishops. And I'm glad that this bishop is starting to become aware of that. And then in the last paragraph, he kind of talks about how the Russian church in Russia has one way of receiving converts. His diocese has another way. Both ways are authentic. Well, That's kind of part of the problem, is saying, well, both modes are authentic and it's really up to the bishop. That's part of the problem, because another bishop is going to end up saying, and another priest from another bishop's territory is going to end up saying, these other Orthodox converts are deficient in one way or another. And this is why those who are received by chrismation, even priests who are received by chrismation only, you generally go to, they go to Mount Athos, and they couldn't actually receive communion. I know of a Greek Orthodox priest personally who says when he goes to Mount Athos, he could not actually receive communion because he was received by chrismation. So it causes a lot of issues. To just say, both expressions are authentic, that doesn't solve the problem, ultimately speaking. Okay, but good for him that he is starting to address this and warn people about Father Peter Ayres and some of the issues going on there. I wish him well. Hope he doesn't have to deal with a ton of hate that I imagine is going to be coming his way for addressing Father Peter Ayres and that crowd. There's a lot of vitriol, a lot of toxic hate that comes your way. I know personally, engaging that crowd and what comes with it. I can only imagine the stuff that's going to come that bishop's way. And so good luck to him. I wish him the best. Let's go to Metropolitan Jonah and some of the comments that he made recently. There were a lot of questions about guys like Jay Dyer. And again, Metropolitan Jonah, who used to be OCA, but then there were some issues there. I think he resigned from the OCA and became ROCOR, if I recall correctly. Metropolitan Jonah is, doing this class. It looks like it's with St. Herman of Alaska Orthodox Church in Stafford, VA. And he's going over cautions with cyberdoxy and an ecclesiology of love for our neighbor. And it's kind of like a series. There's several of these, I think 4 so far. And this is one of 4. And he's talking about some of the dangers with online Eastern Orthodoxy, which I found interesting because I always wondered why in the world he would associate with Jay Dyer and do videos with him. Did he just not know? I kind of suspected that he just wasn't really aware of what all was taking place, and he just assumed the best and produced content for them. But then I noticed that stopped. And I think now we know why, because he comments on Jay Dyer specifically, warns people away from his content, and then also speaks about online Eastern Orthodoxy as a whole and has a lot of criticism. Let's maybe start with his claim that the polemical stuff that you find in Eastern Orthodox apologetics is coming from a place of hatred. So it's not coming from a good place. And you know what? I agree with him. And I would also say that there's some stuff that I see in Catholic circles with online apologetics that also is coming from a place of hatred. This is a two-way street. It's not just the Eastern Orthodox who have this problem. I see this with Catholic apologists. I get that pushback from them. I get the vitriol from some Catholic apologists. So I know that this isn't unique to just the Eastern Orthodox, but he is going to just be addressing the Orthodox here. But I find it interesting given that he was indirectly supporting some of this stuff at one point, and I'm glad to see that he has abandoned that. Perhaps now he has become aware that he was implicitly involved in it by establishing platforms like this. Let me go to the video here. Let's see. Let's start around 32:21. Let me actually make sure that you can hear it. Enable audio. Okay, let's begin here.
If you look at a lot of the polemics, the polemical stuff, it's coming from hatred, right? You've got people who hate the Roman Catholic Church. They hate Protestantism. They hate Protestants. They hate Roman Catholics. That's not Christian. That's not how the church works. You can hate the ideology, but you don't hate the people.
Now, of course, they're going to say, well, we don't hate the people, we just hate the ideology. But in reality, it's clear that they hate both, right?
You can see how an incredibly harmful ideology destroys people's lives and spiritual life. I mean, look at Calvinism. That's my favorite example. That it destroys people's spiritual lives. They become, anyway. We can't validate anything that is motivated by hatred. Jesus didn't say, hate your enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies. And it shouldn't be us who declare them our enemies. They can declare themselves to be our enemies. But the mark of the true Christian is that there is no hatred, that we can't accept hatred. And this unfortunately is what was coming out in some of that dialogue on the internet. I mean, it's vicious and it's hateful.
Good for him for speaking up against this. Good for him. Whatever differences I might have with him ecclesiologically and doctrinally here on the papacy, on the filioque, whatever differences we may have, good for him for at least standing up and saying this. Good for him, because he's going to get severely attacked by his own for doing this. There are going to be a ton of Eastern Orthodox people who start to slander him, viciously attack him, create all kinds of horrible rumors about him that aren't true. Good for him. God bless him.
We live in our society, in contemporary America. You have vast, the left is pushing hatred of their enemies, hatred of conservatives, hatred of Christians, and persecution. You look 100 years ago, what was going on in Russia.
All right, so very, very helpful stuff there. Let's go to another part of the video where he's asked about online orthodoxy. I mean, the whole thing's kind of about it, as you can tell again by the title, but let's maybe go around here.
Somebody like Jay or somebody like Father Deacon Ananias is saying,
so they're talking about Jay Dyer, Father Deacon Ananias Sorem.
no, Orthodoxy is true. These other confessions are not true.
Because what's being discussed are the deepest mysteries of the church. Now, how do we enter into the deepest mysteries of the church? Now, this is according to the ancient fathers, this is stuff catechumens and even new Orthodox shouldn't even know about.
So he's saying a lot of the stuff that these guys online talk about is just uncalled for. It's inappropriate because it's not content for people who are being received into the church or inquirers.
This is the fine fillet. This is not filet mignon. This is not the milk. What catechumens need, and in fact in the early centuries, what catechumens were given, there was no theology whatsoever.
That's not true.
It was all.
They didn't even hear the creed.
They didn't have the creed and they didn't have the Lord's Prayer. And the reason for that was that it took being initiated by the grace of the Holy Spirit through baptism and chrismation and receiving the Eucharist to have one's nous enlightened, so that they could begin to understand the theology.
How did they know what they were converting to then?
Because it was all about how do you act, how do you live as a Christian.
It was a both and. He's kind of painting with broad strokes here that are inaccurate.
And the essence of that is love your neighbor. Now, is it a really loving thing to call people all sorts of names and be really rude and nasty?
And here again, he's talking about Jay Dyer, Deacon Ananias Sorem, and others.
Not usually. Is it a loving thing to call them heretics and, go into hell and dismiss them and judge them? And
Well, what they will point out, your guys like Dyers, they'll say, well, you have, this or that person in the Bible who calls, these people dogs and wolves, and this and that church father said this and that about this heretic, and look at the names he called them. And so that's where they're coming from. And that's what they'll use to justify the most unchristian behavior that you could imagine.
no. And this is where the dialogue on the internet went among in cyberdoxy.
Well, they tend to adopt kind of a Crusader and Inquisition style from the Middle Ages, and they I know they feel like they're defending the faith, but they're doing it in a way that has been rejected by Orthodoxy.
Right, because the presuppositions are fundamentally Protestant.
Oof! So he's saying ultimately their presuppositions are Protestant, which is interesting because Jay Dyer, actually, he holds to presuppositionalism, which is Protestant, but that's obviously a play on words here, right?
Because it's a reduction to rationalism. And this is not Orthodox dogma. When it's reduced to rationalism, that's not the faith of the church.
This is where he starts to go off track, and I think he starts to fall into some theological errors, but hear him out.
Because what the dogma is not, it's not the doctrines. I mean, it's not the doctrine. It's not the decrees of the ecumenical councils.
Yeah, no, he's off there. I get what he's saying here, the spirit of what he's trying to say, but yeah, no, it's a both and, it's not an either or, and he's kind of going with the either or. This is something I often find with Eastern Orthodoxy. It's kind of either or. It's Protestant in many ways. It's a reactionary position, and you can see it in a lot of Orthodox figures. Here it is.
It's not even the scriptures. It's the experience of God.
So he's saying it's not even the scriptures, not even the councils, dogmatic decrees that are dogma. It's the experience of God. It's an all of the above. It's a both and. It's not an either or here. The dogmas of the church, the scriptures are pointing you to that ultimate reality of God. Absolutely. Do they exhaust the mystery of God? No, they don't. Of course, we all agree. But you can't just demote the scriptures or demote the dogmatic decrees of the councils and say they're not dogmas. Come on now. That's just going too far. Obviously, they are dogmas. We're now starting to be a little too reactionary, and we need to go to the both and, not the either or. But this is what you'll find often with Eastern Orthodox, is this reaction against Catholicism, which they want to say is overly rational, overly doctrinal, dogmatic. Well, why do they have to say that? Well, because they don't have a magisterium that is universal and really objectively identifiable, that can settle disputes on a universal level. They don't have that. In fact, in the same video here, Metropolitan Jonah says, we don't have infallibility in Eastern Orthodoxy. Which is something you hear a lot, actually. Yes, that might be a shock for some of y'all. Some of y'all say, well, wait, hold on. I thought the ecumenical councils are infallible. For some Orthodox, other Orthodox actually take the view that in and of themselves, they're not infallible, only insofar as they express the universal consensus of all Orthodox. Are they infallible? Yeah. You'll find that in Eastern Orthodoxy.
That the fathers took and had the skills and the tools to put into words, and the words of the dogmas and the doctrines and the fathers are anagogical. In other words, they raise the mind to contemplation of God.
Yeah, it's a both and, not an either or. But here's what he's kind of saying against your Jay Dyers and online Orthodox. He's saying, look, they're too rationalistic, and that's the error there. They're too rationalistic.
Because ideally, and the scriptures as well, and this is the whole point of the ancient method of dealing with the scriptures. In the ancient church, they didn't study the scriptures.
Actually, they did.
They didn't analyze them and pick them apart and, and try and figure out, what happened when and where and who and
Actually, they did.
all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely wrong. This is an overreaction, not very helpful, but I appreciate that he comes out and speaks against this stuff. But he opens himself up for criticism, and he opens himself up for being dismissed by the Eastern Orthodox apologists when they hear this kind of stuff. They'll say, well, listen to how wrong he is here. And so clearly he's wrong in how he evaluates us. So that's kind of unfortunate. He kind of opens himself up for dismissal there. Even though I think what he's saying and the spirit of what he's saying and what he's ultimately trying to get at, there's truth to it, but it's not being expressed well at all. Okay, so here somebody asks him about Jay Dyer while Jay Dyer is texting him.
Oh, that's Old Testament.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
They cut you some slack when you're a king.
So, and in the case of the cyber docs, actually Jay Dyer, when he was in his really zealot stage before the Deacon started talking to him, he actually kept me from the church for years.
So this guy is saying that Jay Dyer kept him from Eastern Orthodoxy for years because of his online content, which is something you'll hear very often.
Because I saw that zealot, aggressive, very pharisaical way of speaking online. At the time, I was an atheist, and it just absolutely repelled me from the church, because what brought me to the church was not these rational doctrinal arguments. It was saying the love of Christians in their lives as martyrs, as confessors, and such that I did not see in atheism. I did not see in arguably other churches as well, especially in the modern age. So it was the new martyrs who brought me to the church, not these rational doctrines.
Yeah.
Because that's where the love, the noetic love, was shown.
It's a both and. You can't separate the doctrines of the church from the experience of God. Those point us to God in that experience. It's a both and. You can't separate them. But again, it's that overly reactionary disposition in Eastern Orthodoxy that instead of just defining what Orthodoxy is, it has to set itself in opposition to Catholicism or something that they find in Protestantism. And that's not helpful, because what it shows is Orthodoxy is not being fully Orthodox. It's just being more reactionary. We're not this, we're not that. And when you do that, you end up undermining some things in your own tradition. The Orthodox tradition is to embrace the papacy. It is to embrace these things. It is to embrace the magisterium. But they're reacting against Catholicism, so they kind of end up pushing those things away and end up kind of going into another extreme here.
Right.
Not in, having a debate with a Roman Catholic over the filioque.
Right. Can we go till 9:30? Is that all right? I think, yeah.
I was just gonna say, in contrast to what you're saying, Jay Dyer, for me, because I was in ministry, like trained in ministry at like with charismatic churches and stuff, with the Assemblies of God, and so like he came off the like as soon as he said that he came from a Calvinist background, I was like, oh, okay, like that's what that is. You know what I mean? In terms of like aggressive polemics. But I, having been in like a ministerial position, like I knew like how messed up bad theology makes an institution, like how many, it's terrible. Like it completely like drives people away from faith too. So it's interesting to hear you say that kind of on a contrast.
It's kind of interesting. I just received a text from Jay Dyer.
I can only imagine what it is. What are you doing talking about me? How dare you? I can only imagine.
That's funny.
Well, they give the example of Father Josiah Trenton, whom I love.
So now they're bringing up Father Josiah Trenton.
I had one of these talks with, I don't know, about some learned elder, but again, this very high-minded, spiritual, never should talk about anything in public or be all polemical, et cetera, et cetera. But then Father Josiah is very polemical in much of what he does. Rock and Sand is extremely polemical. He had a whole piece I just saw recently, why the filioque is a heresy.
Yeah, he's bringing up the video that Father Josiah Trinum just did, Why the Filioque Way is Heresy, which I refuted already. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It was horrible. It was atrocious. It was outrageously ignorant, inconsistent, and biased. And that's not the first time we've seen that from him. I also reviewed his other video about Catholicism from a few years ago, which was absolutely atrocious as well. So he's saying, look, these guys will point you to the elders and sanctity and piety and not to be polemical, and yet they go and act very polemically themselves. So that's kind of what's being brought up here with Josiah Trinum.
And so, I mean, I don't know, I can understand being personally nasty or throwing in, hurling insults at people, things like that. Sometimes people do get a little heated, and but I also realize I'm a boomer, and, the younger guys tend to be a little rougher in their expression, and I get that too.
Yeah.
But, there's got to be some balance here between saying that you should, you should never go out in public and engage in polemics on behalf of the faith. You should spend all your time pretending you're, up on a mountain somewhere as a hermit.
Right, and that's not the case either. Is it? It's an X or a millennial thing.
Or do you have this idea, and again, this comes from some very liberal circles. The idea is that only we should be able to authorize who's allowed to go out and talk in the faith, and unless you've received a stamp of approval from somebody with a title, you shouldn't be allowed to talk about this stuff at all. We should denounce it.
Well,
we're getting that from some very liberal people.
Well, liberal means control.
Yes,
It's all about control.
Because then I think that's figuring out now the Holy Spirit. Because I feel like the Holy Spirit uses goofy and uses people that you might not think should speak. So that's controlling potentially what the Holy Spirit is trying to do.
Okay.
All right, let's go to this part about the 37-minute mark, which I found interesting. He talks about an Orthodox saint and his perspective on Catholicism, which I can imagine the online Orthodox are going to have their hair on fire when they hear this.
Symbolic thing. So we so I think in many ways are missing the opportunity to evangelize in a way that people, in a loving way that people can understand.
Well, I think it goes back. One of the things that makes me think of is the words of Saint Silouan. When there was a hotshot young archimandrite who came and was bragging to the fathers at the monastery, it went back to Mount Athos, and so he must have been in the Catholic country. So he was saying, yeah, I'm going and I'm giving it to them. I'm telling them they're going to go straight to hell if they don't become Orthodox, and everything that they've ever been told is a lie, and all of their everything they do is false, and they have to come to us and to be the only real Christians. And Saint Silouan said, wait a second. Do they believe in God? Yes.
See, that's the problem already. Let me stop there before we continue. That's the problem. The online Orthodox are going to say, no, they don't believe in God. They're practically atheists. And here's how the Filioque leads to atheism. I kid you not. And they will actually get that from some Orthodox authors, that the Filioque leads to atheism. And so they're really atheists. I kid you not.
Do they believe in God? Yes. Do they believe in the Trinity? Yes.
Actually, the online Orthodox polemicists are going to say, no, they don't believe in the Trinity because of the Filioque. And they're going to say, the Filioque is heresy. And here's how it is a denial of the Trinity. And it's this heresy. And it completely denies the Orthodox understanding of the Trinity and the sacred scriptures. And it's demonic and it's satanic. And it's the crown jewel of all heresies. And you'll find that. So actually, this doesn't work with the online polemicists, and that's what Metropolitan Jonah doesn't realize. He doesn't realize how far they've gone. He thinks that if you could just say, well, look, they believe in God, they believe in the Trinity, right? No, they're going to say we actually don't. That's how far this has gone. That's how absurd they have become.
They believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Yes. Do they venerate his mother? Yes. Do they have sacraments? Do they have
Uh, there's a whole lot of Orthodox who are going to say, no, we don't have sacraments. We're graceless. Hence the whole controversy with Father Peter Ayers. And so it seems to me Metropolitan Jonah doesn't realize how bad it has become with online Eastern Orthodox apologetics. They're going to say, no, we don't have sacraments. We don't have the Trinity. We don't have God. We don't have anything.
the Eucharist? Yes.
Some of them are going to say we don't have the Eucharist. This is how problematic it is. They're going to say we worship bread and wine.
And on and on and on. And so he said, okay, so if you tell these people that everything that they believe is a lie, they're going to know that you're the liar and completely reject what you're doing. But what you need to do is you need to say, yes, these things are good. This is true, but there's more.
That is how I feel about what we need to be telling the Eastern Orthodox. I appreciate it. I just think we need to flip it around. There's so much good in truth in Eastern Orthodoxy, but you're missing the fullness of the faith in the institution that Christ established through the Magisterium. And so, and that then leads to all kinds of doctrinal problems among the Orthodox. But if they had the Magisterium, that would resolve all of the problems immediately. They would no longer be fighting on whether or not the filioque is heretical or not. Some say it is, some say it isn't. They won't fight over original sin. They won't fight over purgatory. They won't fight over the Immaculate Conception. They won't fight over reception of converts and how that works, and grace outside of the formal boundaries of the Catholic Church and how that works. And they won't have those fights because they would have the ability to settle those things through the Magisterium. So I feel like that's the message that the Orthodox actually need to hear themselves. You have so much truth. You have so much of the good that God has given to his church, but you're missing something important here.
This is St. Silouan. I'm just quoting. And if we can approach things this way, what are we doing? We're loving those people into the kingdom of God. It's not about hating them. It's not about, we can say, well, and we believe certain of the doctrines are in error, and their doctrines, or some of the doctrines are harmful or not true. But there are the things that are good and true and right. How many here became Christians before they ever heard of the Orthodox Church? Yeah, because I baptized a whole bunch of you.
Which isn't common, as we've seen from stats. For better or worse, many of the converts to Orthodoxy are, existing Christians from other communions. Well, anyways, kudos, even though I don't agree with everything he said, kudos to Metropolitan Jonah for standing up and speaking against some of this stuff. I know he's going to get a lot of hatred from this, and so certainly wish him the best and glad to see it. Hope that more people will speak out against this, and then I also hope that Catholic bishops start to become aware of how bad some Catholic online circles are and begin to address it. But the problem is, as smaller as the Orthodox dioceses are, and if they're not really aware of how bad it is online, can you imagine how much more Catholic bishops are not aware of what's taking place online? And that's part of the problem. They need to be more aware. We need to help them become more aware of what's going on so they can start correcting some of this stuff. Well, anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed it. If so, hit the like button and the subscribe button. And if you want to support me here on this channel so I can continue to give you more content that you enjoy here at Reason and Theology, check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll get access to extra content and you'll be supporting me. Also, I have a link to a GoFundMe there in the show notes if you want to support me through the for this channel through that platform. I also have a PayPal link if you would rather just use PayPal. So there's that as well. All right, that's going to do it, y'all. Help me grow this channel again by hitting that subscribe button and hit the bell for notification so you know when I go live. God bless. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the Magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.